The UK, as you can see, is a slightly different chart in the sense that there's some significant measurable upside and, as you've seen elsewhere, some very significant downside. And if I just tell you a little bit about the timeline for the UK, because it differs slightly from the other areas we've been discussing. We had our first case of COVID was confirmed at the end of January and didn't get the first death until early March. So you can see that sort of trigger point as we're approaching, the number of cases increasing and then deaths beginning in March. And mid-March, there was an introduction of social distancing, which turned into, I think, 23rd of March, a nationwide lockdown. And so late in the day, but a sudden decision to lock everything down. And that was originally for, I think, 3 weeks as it was announced, but that turned into a much more extensive lockdown with an announcement that restrictions were going to be lifted not until, I think it was the 10th of May, and then big wide-ranging changes at the beginning of July. So you have that very extensive period till July of quite significant restrictions. Since then, the restrictions have been eased, but there remains in the UK tremendous public uncertainty about what the outlook is. At this moment, the number of deaths is increasing, though statistically, the number of deaths increases at this time of year as winter flu kicks in. And in fact, the number of deaths is in line with what we've seen in previous years. But the number of cases of COVID-related, respiratory-related death is increasing. And so those different statistics affect the population in different ways. But there's a lack of consensus as to what the future brings. And we in the UK are at the start of our academic season with young people returning to university and mixing up in large numbers. And there is a sense that that may cause further trouble in relation to COVID. So that's the time scale of all of this. And as I say, a number of different stories that map onto each other, as you can see from the lines here. The first of which is that freight has held up extremely well. There is a peak in the air cargo freight that relates to the use of air cargo, particularly for medical devices. But there is a sense that the population of the UK have reacted quite quickly to embracing e-commerce in all its forms. And what we've seen is essentially an acceleration of a trend that was already existing. The UK was already relatively advanced in European terms in terms of e-commerce and has been able to embrace that very significantly. So you see the express shipments lines doing well relative to previous years. The second thing you see is the public transport elements. What we've seen is public transport doing much worse than personal individual transport. So car traffic stopped during the lockdown, but has been returning to some form of normality. But the public transport has been affected by an increasing concern about health in the choice of travel. The whole notion of mass transit, which in the UK has been highly congested for a significant period of time, has raised all sorts of public debate about the appetite for getting onto congested buses, trains, and other forms of transport. And it's hit the UK particularly badly because relative to other places in Europe, many of our systems, the rail operators, the bus operators, are privately owned rather than wholly government owned. So these are private sector organizations struggling with no or little revenue. And they've been funded through regulated fares historically, but what we see is the government getting more actively involved, central government getting more actively involved to find our way through that. The third thing you see is around air traffic, which, as you can see from this chart, is still down very considerably year on year. And a lot of this is driven by public concerns, public health requirements about the need to quarantine on return from many destinations, which appears to be affecting behaviours. There are both restrictions requiring people to quarantine when they arrive back in the UK, but also uncertainty caused by changing rules as various trigger points are reached due to COVID levels in other European and other countries. So what we find is periodically the rules change as to a requirement to quarantine if returning from a particular country. There's a rush of people to get back from that country into the UK before they have to quarantine for several weeks. And that is, widely publicised in the media in the UK. So this sense that people aren't sure as to what they're going to be able to do has led to, as Nina described for Germany, a lot more short-term interest in travel, but very little planned travel for individuals. So that has affected the whole air system very, very significantly. What you notice about this relative to some of the other charts that you've seen is that in many cases the lines are pretty flat between August and September. So there's a level of sort of stable uncertainty, if you can describe it that way. This isn't yet the new normal, but there's a sense that we're going to be in a period of great uncertainty for some significant time to come. So people's behaviours have, to a certain extent, settled to cope with the current uncertainty. The last thing I would mention is around Brexit and the uncertainty to do with the effect of our leaving Europe at the start of next year. In order to see how that plays out in terms of people's behaviours, but the ability to run businesses, particularly in relation to freight, because the new rules and regulations on exports to Europe are clearly going to have some impact on the way in which those freight markets work, could lead to further congestion. There might be an impact on tourism. That is uncertain, though my sense is that is likely to be less significant than the COVID effect. I think what happens in that will be dominated by COVID thinking rather than Brexit. But the Brexit environment just adds another level of uncertainty to what the UK is facing at the moment. And given all of that, if I just finish with the speed at which things are moving here, I think it was British Airways announced only today, a number of hours ago, a further reduction in their flight schedule as the reality that this is going to be with us for some time becomes more certain.